Danny Iny has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, Entrepreneur, and he contributes regularly to publications including Inc., Forbes, and Business Insider. He has guest lectured at McGill University as well as Yale University, and he's the author of multiple best-selling books about online education. His most recent book, Leveraged Learning, is hot off the presses. It just came out in October, and it's the culmination of Danny's research into the latest work in neuroscience, instructional design, and recent breakthroughs in education. The book aims to sow the seeds of education's transformation in the coming years. So please welcome Danny to Google New York.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. So once upon a time, there was an emperor who was powerful and influential, and all of his strengths and resources were exceeded only by his vanity. He wanted the most wonderful, resplendent refinery that could be found in all the land. But where was he to find this wonderful, resplendent refinery? There was no Google. He could not type in where it is, so he put out an RFP. He had his missives go out to all the tailors in the land saying, bring to us your plans, bring to us your sketches, bring to us your fabrics. And the tailors did. They came to the royal court, and they paraded in front of him, and they displayed their wares, and he was never satisfied. Until finally, two men approached the emperor. They said, "Sire, we have the most wonderful garment that we can create for you, of a magical fabric, of unsurpassed beauty." And the emperor was excited. This is what he wanted, the best of the very best. And so he had his men bring a giant chest of gold coins to these two men. They took the chest of gold coins and they went away to work. Except they didn't work because they weren't tailors, they were con men. So they goofed off for a few weeks while they were supposed to be working. Then they returned to the royal palace. And they said, "Sire, we have brought to you this wonderful, incredible garment. But we must tell you something important about it. You see, it is made of a magical fabric. And all who are wise or worthy, who gaze upon it, will see the most beautiful construction they've ever seen with their eyes. But those who are not worthy, those who are not deserving of their post, those who are incompetent, will see nothing." And then one of the tailors reaches into his bag, he pulls out his arm, and he's holding nothing. And the court is smiling nervously because they're all thinking, am I the only one? I don't want to be deemed unworthy and incompetent, because being deemed as incompetent and unworthy inside the emperor's court soon leads to being beheaded outside the emperor's court. And so they all smiled nervously. And the emperor, not wanting to lose face in front of his subject, said, "Wow, what gorgeous refinery. I am thrilled." And he made a show of putting on nothing and gave them their gold coins and sent them on their way. And then finally he says, "I want the entire kingdom to see the great beauty and wonder that I now get to wear." So he organizes a parade, and he's marching down the street with fanfare and music. And all his subjects are smiling nervously and cheering, until finally a small boy looks at him and begins to giggle and says, "Mommy, the emperor is naked." And as parents, we've all had those mortifying moments. And that's how the parents felt for a moment. But then the crowd bursts out laughing, because of course they had realized that the emperor was naked. Now, this is an old story. It was written by Hans Christian Andersen almost 200 years ago. The emperor has no clothes is an allegory for something that everyone knows is not true, but nobody acknowledges it's not true. And for that final moment, when the little boy points at the emperor, says the emperor is naked, everyone bursts out laughing. There are two awakenings that have to occur. First, there's the private awakening. This is the individual citizens gazing upon the emperor and thinking to themselves, "I don't think he's wearing any clothes." And that stays inside them. Later, there's a public awakening when they call out the emperor. Now, it takes a very different thing to have that private awakening and then to make it public. The private awakening happens when you have an impression based on your experiences, based on your thoughts, based on your perspective. The public awakening happens when you feel strongly enough about it and you feel that you can support the argument with enough rigor when others disagree. Now, emperors can be people, but more often they're ideas, they're institutions. And the biggest emperor in our modern world is higher education. We orient our entire lives around it. We spend the first 18 years working to get in. We spend the next 18 years paying it off. And another 18 years saving up so that our kids can start the same process. I had both of these awakenings about higher education. And these two awakenings were prompted by two pivotal moments in my life. The first was when I was 15 years old. Now, a little bit of backstory. As a child, I was the goody two-shoes, teacher's pet, always gets perfect straight A's. I was that kid. And that worked for me until about the end of the 8th grade. But then I got into the 9th grade, and it was like a switch flipped in my head. And I sat there in class, and I just thought to myself, oh my God, I am so bored. I can't take this anymore. And so I started cutting classes. Now here's the thing about me. I'm a bit of an extreme personality. I don't do anything halfway. And so in that first trimester of the 9th grade, I missed 152 classes. 152 classes. I was barely there. And the number just went up from there. This went on for about a year and a half, till about the middle of the 10th grade. I was 15 years old. And then I just had this moment. I looked in the mirror and I paused. I thought to myself, Danny, what are you doing? Like, what's the plan here? Am I just going to keep cutting classes and going to the gym and watching MTV all day? Which is what teenagers did back then. This doesn't make sense. So I think it's time. I'm going to make it official. I'm going to quit school. I'm going to start my first business. The prevailing narrative around me at the time was not encouraging of this idea. The prevailing narrative said, Danny, you are making a huge mistake. You are throwing your life away. Now let's unpack that. There's two things there. Danny, you're making a huge mistake. Basically saying the consequences of this decision will not be positive. I disagreed. I had a different perspective, but I was like, you know what, I could see that. I don't know everything. I might be wrong. But here's the thing I couldn't get on board with. You are throwing your life away. This implied irreversibility to the decision. Not just it's the wrong move, but your life is over. This is it. It's the end. And I thought to myself, that doesn't make sense. Like, in a worst case scenario, I can always just go back to school. Like, this is a reversible decision. And so I went ahead and I dropped out of school thanks to the support of some people in my life, especially my mom. And I started my first business. And it turns out it was one of the best decisions I could have made for myself. I got to experience things I never would have otherwise experienced, learn things I never otherwise would have learned. Played out great. Now, as a little aside, I want to clarify something. Because there's a difference between dropping out, meaning opting out. Meaning saying, you know, I don't like the instructions that have been set out before me, so I'm just going to quit. I'm going to opt out. I'm going to sit on a couch, watch TV, and eat pizza all day long. That's not just dropping out of school, that's dropping out of life. There's a huge difference between that and saying, I'm opting in to something else. I'm going to take a self-directed and curious approach, and I trust that I will find a way to do it. So I'm not advocating that anyone drop out, opt out, and that's it. I think opting for something better is worthwhile. So that was the first instance. I was 15, I dropped out of school, and it worked out pretty well. Now let's go on to this second crossroads in my life. I'm going to fast forward 10 years. Now I'm about 25. And in those intervening 10 years, I had been involved in a whole bunch of different businesses. I had gotten to do a whole bunch of interesting projects. And most recently, I had tried to build a software company. We were developing technology that taught kids how to read, which is something I always cared a great deal about. And we raised some money from friends and family. We got some really good early traction with our prototype. The experts loved it. The kids loved it. But the parents and the teachers, who were the actual customers, they didn't get it. I was a very young and very inexperienced CEO in what in hindsight is the most complicated industry on the face of the earth. And by the time this young and inexperienced CEO figured out what I needed to do and how things needed to go, we were almost out of money, and it was August of 2008. In September of 2008, the markets crashed, the bottom fell out from under everyone, and I walked away from that experience with about $250,000 in personal debt. It was not a great time in my life. And when you have that kind of setback, you question your decisions. You question the path you've taken. You think, maybe I need a little more security. Maybe I need a little more stability. Maybe there's some virtue to a more traditional path. And I said, what if I go back to school? What if I go to business school and get my MBA? So I applied to schools. I got into one of the top business schools in Canada. I didn't have a high school diploma, by the way, because even institutions of higher learning that value higher learning, they have exception paths for people who have interesting backgrounds and interesting experience and who are resourceful enough. So even institutions of higher learning don't actually value the traditional path as much as they pretend. But I get into one of the top business schools in Canada, and the prevailing narrative around me this time was, Danny, this is great. You are going to set yourself up for life. You're going to learn the things you need to learn. It's going to open all the doors. You know, this is the best thing you can possibly do. So the expectation is that the consequences would be uniformly good. Nobody talked about reversibility or irreversibility. Who wants to reverse something that's going to be all good? Well, I went ahead, I committed the time and very substantial amount of money that it took to go through this program. I earned my degree. And as it turns out, if I had to make a list of the 5 or 10 worst investments of time and money in my life, this would be high on that list. I had some great teachers, but I also had a lot of mediocre ones. I met some interesting people. I also met a lot of mediocre ones. The brochures promised all the future leaders of tomorrow. The class held all the middle managers of today. So it was not an impressive experience. It was certainly not worth the investment. And again, a clarifying point. People will often say, Danny, wait, are you saying you're better off without an MBA than with one? And the answer is no, of course not. But it's not about, am I better off with it or without it? The question is, am I better off with it or with the other things I could have done with that time and money? And the answer is, I could have done much better things with that time and money. So it's about the opportunity cost, and it wasn't worthwhile. Now, the contrast between these two junctures in my life was interesting. Dropping out of high school at the age of 15, everyone said it would be a terrible idea with irreversible consequences. Neither of those turned out to be true. And going back to school, getting my MBA, everyone thought it would be a great move. But it wasn't, and it was completely irreversible. I can never get that time or that money back. What I've since found is that these experiences, less the high school thing, because most people stick it through at least that far, but especially the outcomes and experience people have with higher education, this was not a unique experience. Digging into the data, I found that if you look at postgraduate employment, look at people aged 22 to 29 who have a college degree, almost half of them are underemployed, meaning they're working in a job that does not require a college degree. So they traded 4 or more years. It takes the average American 7 years to complete a 4-year program. So they traded 4 to 7 years of their lives, tens if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. The average American graduates from an undergraduate program with over $30,000 in debt, which you figure in the interest they're going to pay over the life of the debt is more like $46,000. They traded that time and that money to get a job that does not even require a college degree. And of the balance, of the slightly more than 50% of people aged 22 to 29 with a college degree who are working in a job that requires a college degree, 3/4 of them are working in a field that is not what they studied. So how much credit can the degree really take? That's kind of messed up. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that all college is bad. America's top schools have a lot to offer besides just the academics, and there are a few schools that are innovating in really interesting ways. If you look at Western Governors in Utah, if you look at Arizona State, you look at Northeastern, you look at the University of Southern New Hampshire, there's some really interesting things happening. But many people don't have great experiences or great ROIs even at the top schools, and most schools are not top schools. Of the thousands of colleges and universities in the US, only about 200 of them are what you can call selective, meaning they accept less than 50% of the people who apply. So you get a mixed experience at those top 200 schools, and most schools are not anywhere near that level of quality. Now, all of that, my experiences and then finding this data, that led to my private awakening of, okay, the emperor's not wearing any clothes. There's something messed up about higher education and people's expectations from it. And it could have just stopped there. I could have just been part of the massive, disillusioned, silent masses. But there are two quirks to my personality that took it further. The first is that I am fascinated and inspired by education. Now, I'm not unique in being fascinated and inspired by something. Everyone is fascinated and inspired by something. For me, that's education. I just find it magical. Not the education industrial complex, which I think is a disaster, but education, the process of empowering people to do things they weren't formerly able to do. There's a great quote that I love by Walt Disney. If you can dream it, you can do it. Countless people have been inspired to great action by this quote, this idea, myself included. And I'm inspired by the possibility of what we can dream. But I'm also fascinated by the fundamental untruth of it. If you can dream it, that doesn't mean you can do it. There's a world of a gap between dreaming and doing. And that gap is bridged by education. So that just fascinates me personally. I think it's amazing that we can spend a day watching videos on TED and be inspired by all the amazing things we know how to do, all the amazing problems we know how to solve. Then we close our laptop, we walk out into the world, we look around, we're like, where is all of it? That gap between what we could do and what we actually do, that's what education does. That's really cool to me. The second quirk about my personality is that when I'm fascinated by something, when I'm excited about something, I talk about it. So when I was a kid, when I was 4 years old or whatever in kindergarten, I'd come home from school and I'd say, Mommy, Mommy, look at this thing I made. And she'd look at it and say, that's amazing. What's it supposed to be? But I was excited and I would do that every day. And that hasn't changed. I write books, I write articles, and I'll come home at the end of the day with a printout and say, Sweetie, my wife, Sweetie, look, you've got to read this article I wrote and tell me what you think. I want to tell you about the meeting I had. I am excited about something, and so I want to talk about it. That just hasn't changed. So being excited about, fascinated by education, and also frustrated and disillusioned with the way that it works in real life, and having a propensity to talk about it, means that I found myself in a lot of positions to get a lot of pushback from people who disagreed. Because after all, the people I have the privilege of talking to are smart, they're educated, and people as a whole, human beings, are invested in the things they have invested in. Dan Ariely's research into the IKEA effect has shown that when we build something ourselves, we value it more highly than if someone else built it for us. Back when fraternity hazings were a kind of sort of acceptable thing, the rationalization was, well, I went through it, and look, it worked out for me, and so I must be invested. Otherwise, what was the point? We are invested in the things that we have invested in. And so there was all this pushback, all this, well, no, education is important. It broadens your horizons, and it opens doors, and it's not even about the classes, it's about the network, and the excuses would go on and on. Every time I would have a counter-argument, they'd jump to a different one. And there's something more fundamental going on there, which is that people don't want to make the wrong choice with the most sensitive and important decisions they'll make in their lives. There's an old saying in business, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. People used to say that. IBM was in a different business then. Well, no one ever said that you're a bad parent because you sent your kid to college. Right? If you don't, a lot of people might say that. Nobody ever said you're throwing your life away because you're going to college. There's this fear of getting it wrong. And this was the thing that really struck me. I would talk to people, even people who agreed with me completely about how fundamentally broken higher education is, how bad of a return on investment people were getting, and they were still conflicted about the idea of not sending their kids to college. It felt dangerous. It felt almost heretical. And that was just weird to me. How can you look at the numbers, look at the data, know that it's a bad deal, and still think, but I think it's too dangerous not to do it? And that led me to do more research, to dig deeper. Remember, I have an extreme personality, so I don't do things halfway. So I started reading articles, and I started listening to interviews, and I started talking to experts, and I started reading books. And I came back to the people who pushed back, and I had counter-arguments for them. And they had counter-arguments for me, and so I went back and did more research, and this cycle accelerated over a 7-year period until this kind of passive, fun thing that I was doing became, no, I'm taking this on, this is a research project. So I went onto Amazon, and I ordered every book I could find about education, instructional design, the science of learning, education reform. And the books arrived. And then I looked at the references in the back, and I ordered all of the books that they were referring to. And I had a mountain of books in my house. My wife was like, Danny, what are you doing? And I looked at this mountain of books, and I was like, what am I doing? There's no way I can read all these books in a human lifetime. And so I hired a research team. I said, I want you to read this book and write me a 20 or 30-page summary with page stamps so I can go back to the original source of every idea and chase it down. And I spent tens of thousands of dollars getting a library summarized that I can dig into and research and organize and think through. I'm a little obsessive. So I did all this. And all of that research culminated into Leverage Learning, the book that I published in October. Now, I did all this research looking for, once and for all, the definitive data that I could show people saying, look, this direction in which I'm saying education is going, look, the data is saying that's really where it's going. What I actually found in the data is that it's already here. There's a great quote by William Gibson. He said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So what does that mean? Well, let me tell you a little story. A couple of years ago, I was on a business trip. I had a layover, so I'm hanging out at the airport, killing some time. And I see a Brookstone store. It's the store that has all the interesting tech gadgets. And having time to kill and liking interesting tech gadgets, I step inside. And I see on display a Yoda doll, Yoda from Star Wars. It's like this big on a pedestal. And as I approach, Yoda's eyes open. And he turns his head a little bit towards me, and he says, teach you to use the Force, I will. And I'm like, cool, okay. And Yoda says, stretch out your arm. And so I'm kind of tentatively doing this. And through some combination of sensors and motors, Yoda gets flung back. I'm like, oh my God, this is so cool. I need to buy this and bring it home. And then, of course, I thought, this won't fit in my carry-on, and my wife will kill me. So I'm not going to buy it, but this was awesome. Thank you very much. And I keep walking in the airport, and I step into the men's room, and I see a line of men in front of a line of sinks, waving their hands frantically, trying to get the motion-activated faucet to release some water. The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. The sensors will get into the faucets too. It's just a matter of time. Now, what does that mean about education? Has the whole world caught on to the fact that education is broken? Not yet, but they are. It's happening. Is education broken already? Yes, it is. And people are catching on to that. And when we're making big decisions about our education, we have to think ahead, because you're going to have to live with the consequences of the decision in the world that exists in 4 to 7 years, not today. So what does this mean for the disruption of education? We hear a lot about the rising cost of education, the student debt crisis. It's $1.5 trillion now in the US, second only to mortgages. It's more than credit cards. It is also, by the way, the only kind of debt you can't even free yourself of by declaring bankruptcy. It's also the kind of debt you're most likely to incur before you're even a legal adult. Pretty crazy. So we hear a lot about the debt, the cost, but we don't hear a lot about the other side of the equation, which is, what is all that money paying for? What is it actually buying? Now, we've already talked about post-graduation employment rates, which are abysmal. They're a disaster. But there's a whole lot more. There's all this stuff that we think is true, all these truisms about the value of college, that just doesn't add up. Let's take, for example, the lie of lifetime earnings. We've all heard the truism, if you go to college, you'll make more over your lifetime. Well, that's accurate, but it's also misleading because you're looking at a massive amount of data as a whole rather than looking at the right pockets of it. So let's start with a little analogy. Imagine you've got a bar and 10 guys are sitting in the bar and they each earn the median American household income of about $60,000. And then Bill Gates walks into the bar. The average income of a person at the bar just shot up by over $1 billion. But none of those guys got any richer. So it's true that as a whole, college graduates earn more over a lifetime than people who didn't go to college. But let's filter out those top 200 schools which represent less than 10%, much less than 10% of college education in the US. Let's take that out of the equation. Let's also take out of the equation a very small subset of highly paid vocation granting degrees. So we take out engineering and medical school, for example. Most of those earnings differences disappear. Let's also remember that most colleges are in major metro areas, which means that most college graduates are in major metro areas where the cost of living is a little higher and the income is a little higher. Let's also remember that if you graduate saddled with enormous amounts of debt, you will have a bias to take a higher paying job that you might not want because you have no choice to service that debt. And let's also remember that just about all post-college earning data is self-reported. So the people who are excited about how much money they're making will presumably be overrepresented. So figure all that in, and that difference disappears. And it goes further, because there's also a question of attribution. Let's look at the top schools. Let's look at, you go to one of those top 200 schools, you will earn more over a lifetime, but is that because you went to the top school, therefore you're earning more, or is it because the people who are going to earn more anyway went to the top school? It's harder to get into the top schools. It takes a higher caliber person, as judged by academics and whatever else. That can be a confounding variable. So research has actually been done to try to untangle those variables. Seth Stephens-Davidowitz, he published a great book the last couple of years. It's called Everybody Lies. He got a lot of his data from Google, which is fascinating. So what he did is he looked at because do we know that people who graduated from Harvard earn more over a lifetime than people who went to Penn State, which is a good but not quite as good school? Yes. But it's harder to get into Harvard. So he looked at the data. He looked at the people who applied to and got accepted to both Harvard and Penn State. They could have gone to either, but they chose to go to Penn State because it was closer to home, it was cheaper, there was a boyfriend or girlfriend there, closer to family, whatever it is. So let's compare that cohort's postgraduate earning with the people who went to Harvard. It's exactly the same. So is it that you make more money because you went to Harvard? Or is it that the people who are going to make more money anyway went to Harvard? There's a huge disconnect between what we think education will do for us and what it actually does. But it raises the question, why? Why is education so out of step with modern life? It wasn't always like this. 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 30 years ago, college really was the golden ticket to the good life, to opportunity, to possibility. It really did open doors. So what has changed? Well, over the last few decades, everything about how we need education to fit into our lives has changed. But education hasn't, not nearly enough. So let's start with the timing of education. The timing of education in our lives has changed. Education used to follow a just-in-case model. You're going to spend a whole bunch of years studying at the start of your career just in case you need it. And this was always pedagogically problematic because we know that the amount of stuff you retain is a lot less than people think. And so the stuff you studied in college 5 or 10 or 15 years later, most of it's just not there anymore. But let's put that aside. The stuff that you learned could still be current, right? The world stayed more or less the same. You could graduate from college, get a job, and be doing a similar job 30 years later, better because you have more experience, but it's the same fundamental skill set. That's not how our world works today. The world changes so much faster. I mean, here at Google, anyone who learned how to code 20 years ago, and that was their knowledge, they'd be useless. They couldn't do anything, right? The world has changed. Larry Summers, the former dean of Harvard, is on record saying everything you learn is going to be obsolete in 5 or 10 years. So we're shifting. We're seeing a shift from a lot of education just in case at the start of a career to actually a lot more education just in time over the duration of a career. The timing of education in formal institutions has not kept up with what we need. But even more importantly, the way in which we need to be empowered by education has changed. Compare again the world 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago with the world today. It used to be pretty static. Things stayed more or less the same. But now things are changing at an ever faster pace because of Moore's law, because of how quickly technology is changing, because of automation, because of AI, because of the acceleration of all those factors coming together. 30 years ago, the world was ruled by experts. But today, expertise is cheap. Being an expert basically means you can answer the questions that Google can answer, and Google is faster. Now we need people who can answer the questions that Google can't answer, and that's not the same thing. 30 years ago, a model employee was someone who could follow instructions with a high degree of competency. And education did a pretty good job of training people to do exactly that. But things have changed. We've all heard the cliches, right? You know, the hottest jobs today didn't exist 15 years ago. We're training people to solve problems that aren't problems yet, using tools that haven't been invented yet, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard those cliches, and they're true. But it raises the question, well then, what does it take to succeed in that world today and into the future? Well, let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine you're about to start the most ambitious, challenging, complicated, sensitive, high-profile project of your life and career. But you don't know anything about it. Now build your team. Who do you want on your team with you? You can't say, well, I need a full-stack developer, and I need a copywriter, and I need a police chief. You can't say I need these things because you don't know what the subject matter is. So you're probably going to say, well, I want people who are resourceful and think well on their feet, people who take initiative and responsibility, people who handle ambiguity well, and people who play well with others. So how does that play out in the real world? Think about the best people you've worked with in your careers. The people who got great results, delivered great outcomes, everyone wanted them on their teams. I'm willing to bet that other than their subject matter expertise, which is also important, these are all people who were resourceful and thought well on their feet, who took initiative and responsibility, who handled ambiguity well, and who played well with others. And what do employers tell us they want? They want people who are resourceful and think well on their feet. They want people who take initiative and responsibility. They want people who handle ambiguity well. And they want people who play well with others. Competence is no longer enough. Our world demands excellence. Memorizing the dots is no longer enough. We have Google for that. Our world demands that we find novel ways of connecting those dots. Knowing the answers is no longer enough. Our world demands that we learn to ask better questions. So given those needs, how does higher education stack up? The answer is poorly. Higher education does a terrible job of preparing us to think critically and creatively. There's a great body of research. You can find the book called Academically Adrift, documenting it, showing that over a third of people going through a 4-year college career as a student show 0 gains in critical thinking skills over that time. This from institutions that are teaching you how to think, not so much. And this is especially scary when you consider that most people going through this 4-year type program, they're in the age range of about 18 to 22. This is a time in our lives when brain development is still happening. You would expect cognitive critical thinking abilities to be growing no matter what you're doing. So what is really going on there? Now this is what I found in my research. This is what I documented in my book. I found mountains of data reaffirming story after story of people who felt baited by the shiny promise of the good life made by college and then switched to the soul-crushing debt and dubious job prospects that they actually got. This is what led to the second awakening. This is what led me to speak out and say, look, the emperor is naked. And I'm not alone in saying that. Clayton Christensen, who teaches at Harvard, he wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, is on record saying that he expects 50% of colleges to be bankrupt in the next 5 or 10 years. I'm not quite that optimistic, but I'm close. Joseph Aoun, president of Northeastern University, wrote a great book called Robot Proof, talking about all the ways in which higher education is falling short when it comes to preparing people for the world of tomorrow. Ryan Craig has written a couple of great books on the topic, College Unbound and A New You. Brian Kaplan has written about this. Many others have as well. We all see that for too long, the cost of education has been going up and the value it provides has been going down. Now, this is a familiar pattern. Cost going up, value going down. That's the definition of a bubble. And bubbles always burst. Sometimes they burst dramatically, like the financial markets did in 2008. Bang! It's all gone, right? 3/4 of the value disappears overnight. But sometimes it's more gradual. Sometimes the way a bubble bursts is more like the air being let out of a balloon. And we have good reason to believe that this is already happening when it comes to higher education. Over the last 5 years, the US saw an undergraduate enrollment decline of 2.4 million people. That's almost 7% of would-be students recognizing that despite the huge power commanded by the emperor, he just isn't nearly well-dressed enough to justify investing years of their lives and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of their dollars. So where does that leave us? And what can we do? Well, first, we can all be smart about our own continuing educations. I'm not necessarily unilaterally suggesting that you forsake and condemn institutionalized education. But I am saying you shouldn't take it as a magical golden ticket either. I'll get it, I'll pay the price, and I'll just trust and hope that things will work out. The cost is just too high. What other area of life do we invest that much time and that much money and just hope for the best? Nowhere. And regardless of whatever formal training you do or don't pursue, you have to take ownership and responsibility for developing yourself into the sort of person who will thrive in the modern world. Someone who is resourceful and thinks well on their feet, who takes initiative and responsibility, who handles ambiguity well, and who plays well with others. So how do you do that? Well, I would love to give you a set of instructions, and people ask me, and that's what they're looking for, but I can't. And there are two reasons for that. First, everybody's different. What they find fascinating and inspiring and fulfilling won't be the same for someone else. But more importantly, how could you possibly develop things like resourcefulness, initiative, and comfort with ambiguity by following someone else's clean set of instructions? It doesn't work. What you need is a shift in orientation. You move away from thinking like a navigator towards thinking like an explorer. Navigators follow directions. They're looking for the shortest or safest or most direct path from A to B. Explorers aim to learn because they're excited about what they might find. So how do explorers get good at exploring? By exploring. You have a model for this right here at Google, your famous 20% time for engineers. The idea being that you should be working on things that are not core to your job. You need to take that same ethos to your own learning, investing, whether it's 20% or whatever the appropriate time is for you, of your time in learning and growing in areas that are not immediately relevant, but are interesting and fascinating and fulfilling. And the world is abundant with tools to help you do this. There are books and online courses, there are TED Talks, there are coaching programs, there are personal research projects, there are entrepreneurial ventures. There are many ingredients, but you have to invent your own recipe. And that's the key. If you have kids or friends or siblings who are considering college, I'm not saying that they should read some books and watch some videos instead. I'm not even saying they shouldn't go to college necessarily. But the first step is to be crystal clear about what it is that you want. And take the time to do it. People can be forgiven for, at the age of 17, not knowing what they want to do for the rest of their lives. How many of us today would like to be held responsible and attached to some decision we made when we were a teenager? Right? It's okay if they don't know, but if you don't know, take the time to find out. Do a gap year. Read a bunch of books about things you might be interested in. Make a list of areas that you might like to work in. Reach out to people working in those areas and take them out for lunch and say, what is it like to work in this area? right? If you think this is a field you want to pursue, say, hey, can I work for you for free? For a month or 2 months or 3 months, all I want is to see what it's like and get half an hour of your time at the end of the month to ask you questions about what this experience is like. People sometimes tell me, Danny, what do you mean work for free? And I say, that's a lot better than paying tens of thousands of dollars. Get clear on what it is that you want. And sometimes something funny will happen. Sometimes this process will bypass the rest altogether. It'll just lead to a job offer. And if that happens, that's great, but that's not the point. Once you know what it is you want to do, you can decide on the best path to get there. Maybe college is the best path. Someone who knows they want to be a surgeon will have to go to medical school. Someone who thinks they want to be a surgeon goes to medical school and then discovers they don't like it, and I know people like that. That's unfortunate. And many paths don't require college as the fastest way of getting to where they want to go. Fundamentally, some training, some education is vocational. It teaches you how to do the job. But in many cases, it's just some generic calling card. It's a degree that is supposed to impress a very small number of people in order for them to open a very small number of doors. So if the goal is to impress a very small number of people, and you're allocating years of your life and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of your dollars to doing it, is there not, potentially at least, a more efficient way of getting the job done? So for many people, college will not be the answer. And then the question becomes, and I get this question every day, well, Danny, if not college, then what? And what people are asking for with that question is a one-size-fits-all answer, right? If everyone doesn't go to college, everyone should go to this thing instead. But that's still the assembly line model of education, with everyone going through the same stations. And that doesn't fit our era of personalization. That's not how things work anymore. What we need is the opposite of a one-size-fits-all approach where everyone follows some right set of instructions. And that leads us to the most important ingredient, which is self-direction. It's not about opting out and quitting and saying, well, I'm just going to watch TV and eat pizza. It's about being proactive in deciding, here is what I'm going to opt for instead. It's about being led by curiosity and charting your own path. And you need to do it. Everybody needs to do it. But before everyone can do it, the people around them need to trust that it can be done. Because that's the terror. Well, wait, no, I mean, people left to their own devices will just watch Netflix, right? And people are reflecting on a very limited subset of their own experience. They say, you know, I work hard at work, but when I get home at the end of the day or on the weekend, I just want to binge Netflix. It's like, yeah, because you're tired from your work all week long. But left to our own devices, people are curious. People are interested. People are engaged. The research, everything that we know about education shows that A, people can do this, and B, we must do this. When we talk about deep learning, powerful learning, there's a lot of misconception about how it works. Many people have heard of the 10,000 hour rule. The idea if you want to become an expert, a master in a subject, you have to work for 10,000 hours. This was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers. It's a great, fascinating, interesting book. He's incredibly talented. And it is based largely on the research of Dr. K. Anders Ericsson, who was so frustrated by how misrepresented his research was that he wrote a book called Peak that talks about deliberate practice. There are 3 big steps in any educational process. The first is the consumption of the new idea, of the new knowledge, right? That's where you're attending the lecture, watching the video, listening to the audio, whatever it is. The second step is application, taking what you've learned and doing something with it. And that can be theoretical, doing homework, writing essays, whatever. It can be practical, applying it in the real world. And then the third step is when you get feedback. Here's where you got it right, here's where you got it wrong. This can come from a coach, it can come from a teacher, it can just come from the real world. I tried to sell something, nobody bought, that tells me something. Although hopefully the feedback is more directive and helpful than just a binary yes or no. Learning happens not in that first bucket of exposure to ideas, it happens in the second and third buckets of playing with the ideas, working with them, applying them, getting feedback, and improving. It's about doing that work and doing it at the edge of your comfort zone. But it's hard to do that. It's uncomfortable. You're going to be pushing out of your zone of comfort all the time. You're going to be doing things that are difficult. You're going to face setbacks. And that means you need to be able to push through discomfort. You need to persevere. Now, Angela Duckworth calls this grit. She published a book about this recently, but she published her first research paper on the topic in 2007. And since then, the idea of grit has inspired the imagination of educators. If grit leads to success, then we just have to teach people to be more gritty. But there's a key thing that gets missed, which is that nobody is gritty about everything. Nobody is gritty about things that we have no interest in. We are gritty about the things that we care about. We're gritty about the things that fascinate and inspire us. So while it's true that grit is a cause of success, grit is also an effect of self-directed inspiration. So for us to engage in that deep and powerful learning and push through the discomfort, it has to be on things and in ways that actually engage and fascinate us. And that is what leads to actual success in real life, again, as documented by research. The key isn't to try to make people gritty about things that they don't care about. It's to empower them to focus their energies on the things that they do. Ultimately, we only become the sort of people who will succeed in the present and in the future if we get excited about learning to figure it out on our own and trust that we can. I hope you will all do that. I hope you will encourage the people that you care about to do the same. Thank you.
All right, questions? All right, starting.
Thanks. I'm curious about the role of social interaction in institutional education. I agree with your assessment completely. For the sake of argument, I ended up at Yale, and I'm grateful for that opportunity most because of the people I met in my class. Mm-hmm. And I think I've learned the most in the last couple of years from those people. And to your point about, maybe it's the ones who are destined anyway who end up there. Where does that enter the balance in the big picture?
Oh, I think it's huge. I think it's incredibly important and incredibly valuable. I would just question, and I mean, everyone can kind of be divided into two categories. There are the people who have functionally infinite resources and the people who don't. So, is it easier to just go to Yale where all these smart people and great people already are? Sure. But does that convenience justify the incredible cost of going to Yale? Maybe not, because if the whole goal is to find all these great people and build relationships and develop the networks, there are more efficient and effective ways of doing that. Like, case in point, you could move to New Haven and hang out with students and build, you can do things without investing in all that. So a lot of the component pieces of higher education are valuable, but the challenge is that it's a bundle. It's like when you had a cable channel, you're going to get cable, you get 427 channels, you only really want 6 of them. But you're paying for the other 421 as well. And college has to be that way because of the cost structures. It's not an easy thing for them to change. So it's incredibly important, but there are probably cheaper and faster ways of getting just those important pieces.
Hi, so I'm totally bought in. You're the god of this thing, and I'm totally into it to the point where I have a side project, which is an educational program, so I'm fully immersed. I've been doing this for about a decade or so. I have a 9-year-old now that I'm shuffling through the New York City public school education system, and with the Manhattan Upper East Side parents, it's really hard not to get caught up in the whole culture and the vision of what, if I'm saying college is this terrible thing, we shouldn't do it, I shouldn't push my kid into it, I also feel what if I'm wrong? This is my child's future that's really in my hands. She'll basically right now buy into almost anything I tell her. I think part of the problem I have is that this ongoing narrative that even for my generation that we've been telling ourselves, which is I'm the first in my family to go to college, or I'm the second generation to go to college. My parents went to college, I went to college. There's something that has built up, and for me to come in and say, but now my daughter will not go to college, I feel like there's this downshift. It's really hard to connect those neurons and be okay with it, unless we had other narratives around But, Uncle Joe, he didn't go to college and he's got like the successful business. And then there's, cousin, Suzanne, and she did, we don't have those stories in the kind of middle class families that I think something like this is trying to touch. So what do we do about that?
So I love that question, which is really 11 questions. And so I'll try to cover all of it, but if I miss some, just call me out and I'll try to come back to it. So there's a lot in there, right? Part of it is it's very hard to go against what you have been taught and trained and society around you tells you feels right. There's all this stuff out there about follow your heart. It's easy to follow your heart. It's a lot harder to follow your brain when your heart and your feelings and people around you are telling you something different. I think it helps a lot to remind yourself that the worst case scenario is not that bad because it is a reversible decision. Right? I don't think anyone should make a unilateral, well, I will never send my kids to college. I do think everyone should move away from the default that option A is that my kids go to college. Right? Let them chart their path, figure out what makes sense, and if it turns out to be college, okay. There are a lot of other paths to success. I also think there's an unfair and unreasonable bar for going to college versus not. Right? If you go to college, success means you land a good job. You make a high 5-figure, low 6-figure income. That's the bar for success. You say, well, I think I'm not going to go to college, and other people have been successful not going to college. Yeah, but you're not Bill Gates. You're not Mark Zuckerberg. So if the bar for success for going to college is a 6-figure income, why is the bar for success for not going to college becoming a billionaire? That doesn't make sense. That's not how ROI works. So I would just keep all of that in mind. And the counter argument is, one of the things I didn't touch on is that a big reason why the value of college has declined, aside from the internal actual value of what it prepares you to do and all that, college has been a signal. Right? It's been a signal that, look, the person who bears this has gone through certain experiences, has certain wherewithal and financial resources, comes from a certain echelon of society, et cetera, et cetera. And the value of that signal is declining for all the reasons we discussed, but also because of ubiquity. Right? It used to be that you apply for a job 40 years ago and your resume has MBA after your name, you're the only one. So you stand out. If everyone has an undergraduate degree, you don't stand out at all. And if you don't, it might actually be an interesting differentiator. Well, what has this person done instead? And so that's a reason why it's gone down. That said, that ubiquity has kind of shifted, and that's part of why the decline in the value, it's kind of shifted what the degree signals. It used to say, look, the bearer of this degree is better than everyone else. Now it says the bearer of this degree is no worse than anyone else. And unfortunately, and I hate to say this, but for people in society who are in a position where they will not be given the benefit of the doubt, right? Where, whether it's women, whether it's people of color, people who are coming from a disadvantaged position, that stamp of, look, you're no better than everyone else, but you're no worse than anyone else either, could have more value. So I don't advocate it in general, and I think there are good reasons to, if you're going to do it, find a way to do it that is cost effective. But that could skew the math.
All right. Can we keep going? We're actually at time. All right. All right. So if you have any questions, come talk to Danny
Thank you.
live. And